Okay, so first of all, welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for our conversation this evening. I think we've got a pretty good slate of topics to discuss and some good people to discuss them. Before we get started, just want to lay some ground rules. I have all of the non-panelists muted for right now, just so that, you know, we can kind of get everything set up, but we will be unmuting you so that you may ask some questions in a little while. We want this to be mostly about giving you access to us rather than us giving ourselves access to you, if that makes sense. We think that as historians that we have quite a bit of insight to some of the stuff that's going on around the United States right now, and give some things some context and talk about how what we're seeing now is the process of literally centuries of history coming to the foreground. Before we get started, I did want to acknowledge that most of the panel is white, and we are speaking from a place of privilege, and our experience as white people are not the experiences of people of color. So what we're going to try to do to kind of decenter ourselves a little bit is talk less about our experiences as human beings and more about what we know about the past, as a way to kind of get at some of the processes that are working here. And I also want to offer the opportunity for people to feel free to critique whiteness. I think that is a big part of the conversation here. That whiteness itself is a constructed category that needs questioning, that needs criticism, and that needs scholarly exploration. And that's something that we're here to do as well. So with that, all that prologue put together, let me again welcome you, and we'll go around for our panelists here. I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves, you know, tell us who you are, what you teach, where you teach it, and then we'll get the conversation rolling. So Dr. Essmacher, if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Okay, so my name is Dr. Melissa Essmacher. I teach history at the Northwest campus. I'm also the coordinator there for, I just found out today, another 2 years. Yay, question mark. But I teach U.S. history, both halves, world history, both halves at Northwest. My area of research is race, ethnicity, labor, and violence. I study riots. And I wanted to have this discussion, contribute to this discussion today, because I know a lot of my students, because I'm currently teaching this summer, I know a lot of the history professors have questions about current events and how it relates to the past.
Thank you, Dr. Essmacher. Professor Pines?
I'm Patrick Pines. I'm a professor of history at Valle Verde campus. I'm also the district coordinator for the honors program, as well as faculty mentor in the Mellon Grant and a whole lot of other stuff. I too am teaching summer one. I had a lot of students that have been asking basically what the heck's going on, right? And the conversations have been decent, but we've got to figure out how to make the conversations better in our future classes and teach what needs to be taught.
Thank you. Professor Camacho, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa Camacho, and I teach U.S. history, both parts at the Trans Mountain campus. And I wanted to be part of this discussion because I know this is something that will inevitably come up in classes and discussions. And I want to hear what other people have to say, and questions that arise and topics that arise, so that I can better prepare for the discussions that I have in my classes. So I'm looking forward to listening and to hearing what everyone has to say.
Thank you. And Professor Keene.
Hi, I'm Catherine Keene. I'm an adjunct at the Northwest campus. I teach U.S. history, both parts. I also occasionally teach European history or world history at Doñana Community College. I wanted to be part of this because, like the others here, I've been teaching summer one, and lots of students have been asking questions about history and race and how that connects to today. And also because I realized that most of my students know the civil rights movements and the major players there, but they don't necessarily know the policies and the laws and the history prior to that, or even after that, really. So.
All right, thank you. And I don't think I introduced myself. I was too excited. I'm Josh Hevert. I also teach at the Northwest campus, so Dr. Esmacher and I make up the power duo that is the Northwest History faculty. We are in the same house. We are married. Just because my voice is super loud. She's in the kitchen and I'm at the Vatican Library. That is where I am. And yeah, so I joined this conversation because as a historian, I felt like I had something to add to it. My students are curious, and some of the questions that I imagine are going to be raised tonight are questions that my students have raised or I have raised to my students to try to prod them and get them to think about these things. And it was kind of serendipitous that all of a sudden statues are coming down, and I already asked my students what they thought about the statues and have for several semesters. So that was particularly curious for me. I am not an American historian by trade. I am a medievalist. So I study the European Middle Ages, but believe it or not, the Middle Ages can contribute to our conversation tonight too, even though we're talking about specifically US history. So if I start going medieval, I can't help myself. It's just who I am. And I promise it'll be relevant. So, do we want to start with a general question that we have prepared for? Do we want to go ahead and open it up right away?
I'm fine with either.
Okay, Dr. Esmacher, you have the master list of questions that your students were asking. So why don't you serve us up something from the pictures map there?
Okay, so I think I'll do the one that's kind of the most general and kind of ease us into conversation as historians and what we can contribute. And I apologize if you hear dogs snarling. It's impossible to get them to be quiet while we're recording things. So one of the things that has frequently popped up in conversation with my students is, why didn't I learn about whatever in school? Like, why didn't I learn about Juneteenth in school? Because it's originated as the Texas holiday. So it seems kind of weird to some of my students that this is the first year they're hearing about it. Or why didn't I learn about the 13th Amendment? Sydney! The 13th Amendment technically allowing slavery in the case of imprisonment, which is why we have prison labor today. Like, why wasn't I taught that? And so I think like this is a good question for us to answer as historians. Why don't we cover a lot of these things about race and US history, especially in K through 12 education? Like, why isn't it taught?
So let me jump in here, because I've been thinking about this one all day. And how I wanted to answer this one. And the first thing that I will say, for those of you who are not aware of how K through 12 curricula is composed, or are composed, since that's the plural form, it is a very political process. So we in Texas have standards called TEKS, which are the basic kinds of things that a class is supposed to cover. You as a Texas student are supposed to learn A through Z, no questions, you have to know it, and we're going to give you a test in 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade about social studies. And if you don't know it, then you will have let your teacher down, you will let your school down, and oh, by the way, your school will receive less funding because your scores aren't high enough. Because, you know, if we have a deficiency, then we take your money away instead of giving you the resources that you need to make up that deficiency. That's a different conversation. So when the history teaks were written, at least the most recent ones, the TEA, the Texas Education Agency, brought a whole bunch of people together, including the State Board of Education and some outside advisors. And let me be frank, there were people on this advisory board who had no business being on this advisory board. And all of their comments are public record. So if you go to the TEA website, you can see exactly what this person who is on the advisory board and has a real political stake in the argument about these teaks, you can see exactly what they thought about X, Y, Z, and everything else. The last time I read it, I was not surprised by the racism that I encountered, but I was shocked to see it just kind of like laid out there plainly. I believe one of the non-historians, I think it was some pastor from a megachurch, it wasn't Joel Osteen, but you know, some pastor from a megachurch, who said that Cesar Chavez was not worthy of emulating or talking about or memorializing in history. In Texas. In Texas. Now, is Cesar Chavez in the teaks? Absolutely he is. However, that's still a part of the conversation. So part of the reason why we aren't getting the history that you're supposed to be getting is because there are people who have a very vested interest in a white supremacist vision of history who are making education policy and telling our teachers what they have to teach. So if you want to get at the root of why history is being taught in Texas schools a particular way, that is where you have to start.
Pat.
On top of that, and that's a good point, Josh, but going even further, it's these same people that decide what the textbooks will look like.
Yes.
And the textbook people, they're in the business of making money, and they look at what California and Texas will okay, and that's what the textbooks are for the entire nation.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly Josh laid out what happens in Texas, but this is what happens in Iowa as well. Mm-hmm. They have, you know, Norton, Cengage, all those people. Some of the reps are really great people, but the textbooks are decided by the California, Texas educational associations and the legislatures. And this past year, God, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was egregious. It was like, yeah, we've decided they don't need to be in the textbook anymore. Oh, Helen Keller doesn't need to be in the textbook anymore.
And Hillary Clinton was the other one.
Yeah, because, well, Helen Keller is just not important. And it's like, okay.
Well, see, here's the thing, is we should be learning about Helen Keller. The thing is that the way we learn about Helen Keller betrays who she was.
Correct.
She
was a socialist.
We learn how she overcomes her deafness and her blindness, and that's a great heroic story, but we don't learn how she was a socialist activist for the majority of her life. I mean, I can understand why somebody who is wanting to combat socialism would not want her in there, but I mean, let's just be honest that is a political decision.
Right. And the space allocated to Eugene Debs is less and less every 2 years.
Yep. I just had my students write on Debs for my 1302 class.
Had they ever heard of him?
I don't know, but I asked them to write a letter to the editor of the newspaper, either calling for his conviction under the Espionage and Sedition Acts or his acquittal. And usually I get about a 50-50 split on acquit or convict. This summer session, I don't know if it's what's in the air or what's just this crop of students, but I would say 90% of them wanted him acquitted. It was interesting.
Yeah, and it is important to note that the State Board of Education positions, those are elected. So for example, in November, when we have our election, whatever format it may be within the age of coronavirus, there will be seats available on that board. And so definitely this is an instance where voting, you know, in all races, local up through national, makes a difference. Even just, you know, your local school boards too, because what the state mandates in the TEKS, right, the standards, those are the basic standards that educators have to do. But because Texas, in normal circumstances, gives their school districts a great degree of autonomy and independence, like you can supplement the curriculum. And so like that's where you can push to be like, let's have, you know, let's give more professional development opportunity or resources for our educators to be able to supplement the TEKS, especially when it comes to the history of non-white folks in the US. Now, not every district's gonna do that, but for right now, that's kind of the Band-Aid solution until we can get a more long-term solution.
Robert has a question.
Yeah, let me go ahead and unmute him real quick. Yes, Bob.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Josh, I'm trying to wrap my head around what you just said. I'm a government teacher, so I don't think logically like you history professors do. Now, what, if I get this right, the school children in Texas don't learn about Cesar Chavez, and they go up through the ranks, and they graduate from high school, and they go to El Paso Community College, where in March, they get a day off to celebrate a man who may not have even existed the way the history books are taught. Do I have that right?
You have it exactly right.
To me.
And I would like to challenge you, if we're back face to face in the springtime, ask your students, who is Cesar Chavez? And they will look at you and say, I don't know. And then my joke is always, well, you can't have the day off till you can tell me who he is.
I'll do that, Pat.
Let me push on that a little bit, because Cesar Chavez is in the TEKS. He's there. It was recommended by this one particular advisor to TEA that he not be in there. Yeah, go ahead, Vanessa.
I was going to say, and you can finish your point now, but I just wanted to ask our participants, when you were taking your history classes in high school, did you know you were missing stuff? Did you kind of have a sense that there was something other than what you were being kind of reading about or talking about in your classes? What were your experiences in those classes? You know, because if you know, Josh, you're saying that Cesar Chavez is in the TEKS, but if the TEKS are the basic level, then are there just certain teachers who are saying, we're not going to talk about him, we're going to talk about this other thing? Then you have other teachers that are saying, yeah, no, we need to know about Cesar Chavez.
Yeah, it's my experience that most social studies teachers say that they often don't make it past World War II. Mm-hmm. And this is despite having a year to do the entirety of 77 to the present.
What we do in 16 weeks.
Yes. And there's reasons for this. You know, I don't want to step on, 9 through 12 educator toes here, because I used to be one. But, you know, there is that issue. And we do a lot of editing, selective editing in our classes too. There are things that we just don't have time to talk about, or don't have time to give the whole story, because we have to move on to the next thing. Like, we could make the American Revolution, for example, a 2-semester course. But in the words of a great philosopher online, ain't nobody got time for that. Bob, you can unmute yourself. I've made it so anybody can unmute themselves now.
Okay, gotcha. I'd like to respond to Vanessa's question. Vanessa, when I was growing up, okay, two of the things that I never learned about until maybe after I'd graduated from high school, one was growing up when I was a kid, I used to think Teddy Roosevelt, he was my hero. He was in my mind, he was the greatest American president ever because of things he did. You know, the whole walk softly, carry a big stick and all that stuff. And then afterwards, though, I started learning some things about him. The other president who comes to mind is, of course, Franklin Roosevelt. You know, we hear about him in a lot of these polls. They rate Franklin Roosevelt among the top three presidents we've had, along with Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. You'll see those three names swirling around at the top in most polls. It wasn't until, and I'm Asian American, it wasn't until after I graduated high school that I learned about the internment camps, where even though we were fighting Japan, Germany, and Italy, most of the people who were taken and put in the internment camps were Japanese Americans, not German Americans, not Italian Americans. But yet that's one part of history that a lot of people have not been exposed to, because, you know, if you have a great president, you don't want to expose his warts, so to speak.
One of the things that I talk to my students about, this is like day 2. I always talk to them about what is history, why do we study history? And I don't even have to plant a student. I know, we study history so that we don't repeat it. And I always want to puke because that's not what history is. One of my mentors a long time ago told me that when we talk about history, history is to society what the memory is to the individual. And if you think about your own memory, especially when you get to be my age, it's not always 100% accurate. Nor should it be. I mean, we embellish stuff, we forget stuff, right? We keep what is important, but when I meet people, I tell them what I want them to know in order to give myself an identity. And that's what history is. History is the collective memory of a society, and we tell the stories that give us an identity. So when we talk about World War II, we talk about the soldiers, the stormed the beaches in the Pacific, that went into Normandy, that were part of Operation Market Garden, that crossed the Rhine, all that kind of stuff. We talk about what a great leader Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were, and all that kind of stuff. But we don't want to talk about internment camps. We don't want to talk about the fact that Churchill, on a certain level, is a jerk, right? That's not the identity that people want to have. So then they come to me and I show them this other stuff, you know, Sand Creek Massacre, the Shirtwaist Fire, some of the other stuff. And students are like, I've never heard of this. I've never seen it. It's not part of that story. And it should be.
It absolutely should be. It does. Sorry, I'm thinking and talking at the same time, which is something that men do, and I apologize for it. There's this saying that I always hear, and it makes me uncomfortable, because what I hear is, you don't learn real history until you get to college. And that, as somebody who's taught K through 12, I reject that. It's you learn history K through 12, you just may not learn the entire story. And there's so many different reasons why that happens. And some of it's nefarious, and we're putting it out there for you. Some of it is, you know, it comes down to the individual who's making a choice in his or her classroom. And we all have our personal biases. It comes along with being a historian. You can't sit above it all and pretend that you are the great arbiter and you are completely objective. And there are some times that we get excited about stories that we really want to tell, or we really want people to know about, that elide other stories. And so what I hope, students who are listening to this, that some of the things that you're kind of gathering from all of the historians who are gathered here tonight is that there's so much more than what you hear or see in a classroom. And that if you really want to know about the past, you need to engage with it. And what our jobs are, more than just, standing up and making a bad joke every once in a while, like I do all the time because I'm a sucker for puns. The other thing that we're trying to get you to do and teach you to do is how to interact with our discipline. How to read a primary source, how to take an argument apart, see what somebody's arguing. Because there is no doubt in my mind that history is a battlefield. It is a war. And if you do not come to the front line equipped, you're gonna get run over. It's difficult. The past can be used against you in ways that you don't even realize sometimes. So if you really want to dig in, take your experience from your History 1301, 1302 class, reevaluate those narratives that you've heard from your past, and continue to take that kind of critical attitude forward into the future, so that when arguments about the past are put in front of you, you know exactly how to handle them.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I talk to my students about is along the lines of what you're saying, is when they hear something and it comes from the history book or whatever, it's like, okay, let's unpack this a little bit. Does this make sense to you? Because if it doesn't, let's talk about it, right? And we begin to have a lot of conversations along those lines. I think that most of us wrap our course around an idea. And we go through the 16 weeks and all the chapters, and certainly we teach everything that's there, or at least, point to it. But we try to focus on what we're talking about, right? And in my class, the last, 2 years, I've been talking about, okay, who gets to be an American, right? We talk about the American dream. We talk about Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all that kind of stuff. And then we get to, and I'll give them a date. It's like, okay, it's 1820. Who gets to be an American, right? And they're surprised that how limited the liberties actually go, right? And I think what's going on in our contemporary world right now has ripped that wound open, and people are looking at it. And I think part of what we're seeing is the surprise in some people that this is the case, right? I was reading this book, and in here, and she talks about this one thing, and I knew, but I didn't know exactly. 40% of students who are expelled from high school are African American.
Yep.
40%.
I knew that.
African Americans today make only about 16% of the school population, but 40% are expelled. 92,000 students were arrested out of high school 4 years ago. To me, that's a huge ass number. I would have, if you would have asked me how many students are arrested, I wouldn't have gotten that high. And 40% of those are African American, and this is weird.
Yep. As Marco points out,
I'll be quiet for a while.
Yeah, as Marco points out in the chat, that is the school to prison pipeline.
Correct.
That is often discussed. in our circles, but needs to be discussed more nationally. I'd like to move on to another topic. We could talk about this for the entire 2 hours. And maybe one day one of us will offer an American historiography seminar, but I think tonight is not that night. So, are there questions in the audience that, does somebody have a question for the audience that they would like to ask? You can unmute yourself.
Hi everyone.
Hi, Laura.
My name is Laura. How's it? Hopefully everyone's staying safe in these times, crazy times that we live in. I wish just, and maybe you can point out if we get to the topic, Josh, how we could incorporate all these discussions and topics in our courses, and what assignments, what discussions can we have, and I'll maybe wait to another topic to go ahead and ask that. So I wanted maybe to share what you guys do. I'm a speech and communication instructor, and what you do in history, because I always borrow from different places, right? And it's all connected. And so, I mean, that's what I was interested in. And I can wait to, if it's later on in the conversation.
Okay, great. We will keep that in mind. Thank you very much. I know Dr. Esmacher has a lot of good ideas that I am imagining that she is willing to share.
Great, thanks.
All right. Is there another question from the audience that you would like answered?
So how do we, or how do you, because I am not exactly one of you all, as you know. I am a high school teacher, was a middle school social studies teacher. And how do you all, as educational leaders in the state, help us to combat teaching to the test, the textbooks, and the fact that that collective memory that Mr. Pines just spoke about so eloquently is controlled by primarily, especially in Texas, the white person?
I can speak to that experience a little bit. So before I came to El Paso, I taught in Hawaii at 2 different University of Hawaii campuses, a private Japanese international college and a community college in Hawaii. And so most of my students were primarily Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, and very heavily Asian. And really the thing that was the biggest barrier when they would come into the history classroom is, well, history is old dead white men. Like, nobody cares about the history of me or my community, or the oral history, because oral history is huge in Pacific culture. The oral history, passed down from my family, nobody considers that history because it's not in the textbooks. And one of the things that I realized as an instructor is that, yes, we have a textbook with a standard narrative. Yes, we have, TEKS in the case of K through 12 in Texas, or SLO, student learning outcomes, right, for higher education. But really, it's really key to empower students to see that the history they learn in the classroom reflects themselves. And so it's oftentimes through doing, like me actively trying, like in that case in Hawaii, because I had a lot of Pacific Islanders, trying to be more conscious to incorporate that history in my classroom, but also trying to structure assignments to empower students to do things like, let's do an oral history and talk to like your parents or grandparents, or, like, let's do like a reflection journal to talk about like what do you not, like, where do you see gaps in the textbook, right, that you would want to fill in that, that doesn't reflect your experience or your culture. And that really does help to increase, skeptically, we would say student buy-in, right? That's like engagement, right? Like, we're increasing engagement. But to me, that's also empowering them as lifelong learners and also active participants in their communities. And I know that community, we're a community college. Most of us work at a community college. Community, sense of community is important. That's one of the reasons that I chose to move to El Paso, because I felt that strong sense of community the same way I did in Hawaii. that I missed. You know, like Josh said, like it's what we do in the classroom ripples outward from the classroom. And, you know, trying to give people the tools to continue to learn about history, to continue to, you know, share their particular experiences, I think is important for us as educators.
Thank you. Professor Keene, did you have something that you'd like to add to that?
I think Dr. Essemacher did quite well on that. I didn't teach in Hawaii, but I lived in Hawaii, so I completely get that. You know, when I moved to the mainland, I was completely shocked by everything around me, right? The history that was being taught and the narrative, and how Hawaii often gets left out, except when we're talking about Pearl Harbor. So empowering students to reflect on what isn't in a text, whether it's the textbook or a primary source or whatever, is key, I think, to making them lifelong learners and making them interested in thinking about these issues that we are facing today as well.
Great, thank you. I know whenever it came time for the STAR test in my classroom, there were things that I was like, okay, here's what the state wants you to know. Like, for example, there's always a STAR test question on the US2 history STAR test about the United States' entry into World War I. And we historians know that that is complicated. We know that the answer is not, N-O-T, not the sinking of the Lusitania. We know that for sure. But we know that it's complicated. It's a combination of a whole bunch of different things. But the state wants our students to know that it was unrestricted submarine warfare. That is the answer. It's probably letter B. So I told my students, that's the answer on the test. Now let's jump in and explore it. So I always found that if I met my students where they are, because they know it's BS, they know it, and they see right through it. They're so much smarter than we give them credit for, even those of us who like recognize the brilliance that is in front of our classroom. Like, I don't think they get enough credit, but they see through the fog, and they have the desire to kind of want to know, maybe not in as much detail as we, professional historians want them to have, but, they put up with us because they're kind people. But, tell them this is, I always told my students, this is BS. Let's jump in and let's explore it. And you come up with your own answer. And usually mine came up with they were really obsessed with following the money. So with
Right.
World War I, they were always like, well, follow the money on that one and look at the bank loans and blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, you're good little Marxists, aren't you?
Receipts.
Yes, receipts.
I mean, you just look at Wilson's 14 points,
yeah,
and pick them apart, and you can see where he thought the war came from.
Oh, indeed. Oh, indeed. All right, let's move to another question. Something else from the audience. We want to make sure that we are giving you what you want.
I'll ask something, I guess.
Great, Marco. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Marco. I teach criminal justice. So you can see the huge intersection that it's going on currently, right? So Dr. Essemacher, I guess for you, since you're, that's your area of expertise, riots, right? How do you explain what's currently going on within the riots and the intersection of, policing and this quote unquote new radical idea of defund the police?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I've had students ask me that. So I always tell my students, when we talk about riots, and unfortunately, like I get to say like maybe a sentence about my dissertation research when we cover World War II, and there were riots. But we get to talk more about riots in the 60s. And I actually had a conversation with my current students because we were covering the 60s last week. And so we had a live chat where we talked about riots. The history of riots throughout the United States, like the idea of a riot as a form of protest, or as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, the language of the unheard, is relatively recent. For most of American history, when we talk about riots associated with race, we're talking about white vigilante mobs enacting violence against minority communities, whether we're talking about African American communities throughout the South, Asian American communities, Hispanic American communities in the Southwest. Like that's what a riot associated with race was punishment to a community. And the Tulsa massacre of 1921 is a classic example of that. And that's because the body count is kind of uncertain. If the upwards estimates are true, that would be the deadliest riot in US history, surpassing the 1863 New York draft riots. And that was the whole thing, right? This community was too successful. It was getting out of their place, right? And so they torched the whole neighborhood, whole African-American community, and killed like about 300 or more people. So the fact that the riot evolves to a form of protest, that starts actually during World War II, which is why I did my dissertation on that, because I thought it was kind of interesting, that shift. And that's when we start to see minority communities engaging in the same kind of activities they're doing today, right? They're not targeting white people, they're targeting property, right? White-owned property, like the Target in Minneapolis, right? That was working with the police department on anti-theft stuff, or, you know, the white-owned shop that wouldn't employ members of that community. So that kind of targeting, like that really starts during some areas in World War II. We still see some old school ones. And so by the time we get to the 60s, riot has become protest. And I always have students go, well, you know, but people are engaging in illegal, like it's illegal activity, it's arson, it's, you know, property damage. And I'm like, well, riots aren't carried out by people who are, you know, logical and rational. Like these are folks at the end of their rope. These are folks who've tried all of the peaceful legal channels and nothing's been addressed. And what's really depressing is this will keep happening, because if you look at reports, riot reports, which start to become a thing in 1919 after the Chicago riot. If you look at 1919 Chicago, 1943 Detroit, 1965 Watts, and the 1968 Kerner Commission, 1992 Rodney King riots in Los Angeles, all of those reports say the same damn things. They all identify the same causes: systemic racism, inequality, police brutality. They all make the same recommendations, and then we don't do anything, and the cycle continues over again. So in the case of riots, as much as I hate, you know, those who don't study the past are doomed to repeat it, it is kind of true in this case, is that we continue to be complacent and do nothing. And so when we talk about that, you know, like, well, we tried, I feel like it's become easier in this moment for my students to understand that, because I'm going to attribute this to Colin Kaepernick. Not Colin Kaepernick, you know, alone, but for my students, when they go, well, name an example of a peaceful protest that didn't get attention. Then, you know, like, because Colin Kaepernick's protest was so predominant and the backlash against him by the NFL was so, you know, all-encompassing, and still kind of is, because he's not employed by any NFL team, I feel like that kind of has become a signal post for them to understand, you know, how attempts at peaceful protest haven't really gotten very far. So I feel like that it's definitely changed. Like when Ferguson happened in 2011, it was much harder kind of to get students to wrap their brains around. But now I feel like the situation is very different. And I feel like when you explain it that way, and then they have this kind of like very public peaceful protest to compare it to, then they get the point, the light bulb goes off.
I was going to say, right, because if we look at post Trayvon Martin and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was strong opposition against BLM, right? And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, in a very short amount of time, so to speak, the amount of people supporting the Black Lives Matter movement just shifted.
Yeah.
It absolutely has.
Well, I think just the fact that everybody has a video camera with them when they're walking around has changed the equation a great deal. And we see so much more video, not just one, but multiple angles of the same thing. And that creates more and more awareness from everybody.
Yeah, it's not that police brutality is all of a sudden spiking or instances of racism is all of a sudden spiking. It's because we have better documentation. We have, like you said, like video evidence, social media, and even then we still have limitations. Please see how Breonna Taylor's killers are still not accountable.
I wanted to add on to some of what Dr. Esmacher says and try to historicize political violence even more. Because if you look at our country's history, whenever there is a lot of social unrest, violence becomes a cure. It doesn't mean it's, morally, that it isn't morally ambiguous, but when human beings feel the boot of oppression and they feel that there is no other recourse, this is what human beings do. So I want to give our audience who may not be as familiar with American history 2 examples, one from 1301, one from 1302. With 1301, I would offer that Shays' Rebellion is exactly the type of social violence, the bubbling up of social unrest that leads to change. And it's probably the most dramatic example of political change that we have in American history. Just a quick primer, just fast, I won't go into the details. Post-American Revolution, the economy was horrible, like bad. So bad that soldiers who had been paid with continental dollars were wallpapering their homes with the money because there was nothing else that they could do with it. So all of these guys had invested what money that they were going to get into farms because, in Massachusetts, that's what they do. They have small farms. Well, now that their money is worthless, they can't make their mortgage payments. So what does the bank do? The bank repossesses their farms. And it's all run out of the county courts, etc. So Daniel Shays and a motley crew of these now like dispossessed farmers march on the Massachusetts Capitol, and they shut the county courts down. And all of a sudden, the Massachusetts governor can't do a whole lot about it because the current framework of the country, the Articles of Confederation, doesn't allow a whole lot to happen. And so there isn't a whole lot of response. So a bunch of our founding fathers decided, hey, maybe we should be able to do something about this. And so they meet in Philadelphia for this little, powwow that they have. And all of a sudden, over the course of some time, we get a whole brand new constitution. And that is exactly how the US Constitution comes about, because there was social unrest that bubbled up, and all of a sudden it proved to the ruling class that there needed to be some kind of change. Now, if you want to argue that the Constitution is more restrictive than the Articles of Confederation, that's a fascinating conversation that we should have another time. And something that is a good discussion post that I should use down the line. But there's that example. Another example, let's look at the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Now, to set the stage for the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, you have to know that this is when the railroad is finally kind of reaching its pinnacle of usefulness, because it is starting to connect disparate parts of the country. It's a provider for a lot of jobs, and it's helping with westward expansion, for better or for worse. And this also happens to be the so-called Gilded Age. Gilded because dudes are getting rich, like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and this guy named Andrew Scott, Thomas Scott, who runs the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, it just so happens that there's a lot of labor unrest because nobody's getting paid really well. The labor conditions are poor, and that's being very kind. And as a result, the railroad workers go on a strike. And this is before unions get a whole lot of power. We don't really even have unions yet. They're called working man's parties, and they're kind of loose organizations. And to make a really long story short, things don't go well for the workers. And so what they do is they blow up the railroad tracks. They blow up the locomotives and the cars that they see as the tools of their oppression. So much so that Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad says, line them all up and shoot them. If they're complaining that they're hungry, let them have a diet of lead instead. He actually says this in a letter. Now, did that violence lead to some change? Yes and no. But again, we see this pattern of an oppressed group feeling like they have no other recourse and using violence as a way to get their message across. And it's not the last time. I think it was in Kentucky, not just a couple of years ago, where mine workers shut down the railroads. I think Bernie Sanders' campaign sent them pizzas one time just to feed them. So that's an interesting talking point. But regardless, we have to kind of get beyond this idea that violence is the abnormal. It's not. Violence is quite normal, and it's part of our human experience. And we can talk about whether it's moral, immoral, amoral, wherever you want to go with it, but we have to recognize that violence is a part of everything that we're going to talk about.
But I think the key difference is, in all of the examples that you mentioned, primarily the people enacting in violence were white, and so it's seen as more socially acceptable, and therefore our history books cover it more than when we have Black and brown people. Right?
Yes, we are much more comfortable talking about class than we are race, and that's a big problem.
I think in thinking about my own teaching, about these the various topics we're kind of talking about, I wonder if students would benefit from not only talking about the victories, kind of making, and I'm too guilty of making that kind of like connection, like, oh, they did this and then this happened, yay, and change. But I'm thinking, I think I need to talk more about the false starts and the pushback and how that makes a movement long and hard and arduous. And I worry about when I hear students say, you have to learn history so you don't repeat it. And I talk to them at the end of the semester about what's the thing you remember, the theme you remember, and kind of putting it together. I worry that in their mind, it's, well, we talked about all these different moments when people protested and it worked, but it didn't work. Like that feeling of, maybe hopelessness or what does it all mean kind of, big conclusion. And so I'm wondering if I need to do a better job of talking about how it is something that is ongoing, and it is something that has false starts, and it is something that that everybody has to be a part of it. I always like to emphasize how, and maybe this is something that speaks to what Jane was asking, that the people that we're talking about, it's not just the leaders, it's not just the people that we can name check, but it's the people who were just regular people who stood up and did something and said this was it. And they faced great danger to themselves, but they still did it. Yeah. So, in thinking about in how I'm approaching these topics, I think that's something I need to be more kind of conscious of.
Yeah. And I think definitely you're right, Vanessa, that definitely is a narrative not only we as instructors often make, but like textbooks too, right? Like there's this forward momentum, this progress, and we focus on the wins. And that definitely impacts student understanding the civil rights movement, because for a lot of students, they're like, oh, the civil rights movement began when Rosa Parks sat on a bus in Montgomery and refused to give up her seat. Well, sure, like the 1950, but even then, like that's past Brown v. Board of Education, which is like a huge seismic change. And like really the civil rights movement, like you said, if we incorporate the fits and starts and not just the like groundswell momentum, dates back to like even before the Civil War. So, but yeah, like because we are so focused on that, and then change happened, right? We lose sight of the process.
Thank you, Marco, for asking that awesome question. It led to some good stuff. I think one of the parts that maybe we didn't address was how this intersects with policing. And I will totally admit that this is not something I know much about.
I know a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. Essmacher, you probably know quite a bit more than I would.
So I actually I had to do some research on this because I had a student ask me questions, and I've been answering some student questions on Instagram about the history of race and policing. And what I found really interesting was like the modern day police system, like taking two very different paths between the North and the South. Where in the North, it was more about like police departments formed in the 1830s, and it's more to protect property in a growing urban centers, and this fear of the unwashed masses, but for them that was immigrants. Whereas in the South, like Southern policing starts to come out of the institution of the slave patrol. And so the sort of surveillance of minority communities and this like very strict policing of them doing activities and kind of looking the other way in the white community very much is a legacy of those slave patrol in the South being the foundation of Southern policing. And, you know, police brutality exists throughout American history. And as long as we've had police departments, we've had instances of that. And like I said, it's been better documented and to some extent more held accountable. But there's this, I mean, that's kind of baked into the founding. And so when people say, you know, like defund police, it's not just give more money to social services like social workers and mental health services and dealing with homelessness and providing more educational and job opportunities, but it's also got to incorporate changing the culture of policing, because right now the culture is very much the end result of that, like using force to police and circumscribe communities, even to the point where I was reading an article about women in policing today, and people being like, well, just solve the culture problem by hiring more women. Well, that's a great idea, and that should be something that we do, but that's not going to by itself change it. If the system, you know, system really needs help, and part of the reason that it's so difficult to just be like, we'll just hire more ladies, is the fact that the culture itself in many police departments is very hostile to women. So yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, on top of the policing, racism is built into every part of our nation, of our great experiment, right? I mean, I keep thinking about the Boston Massacre, right? And Crispus Attucks, who was a hero. I mean, he should be a revolutionary hero, but and sometimes he's considered that. He even had his own postage stamp. I vaguely remember that as a young person. But even at the time, John Adams, when he was defending the soldiers, pretty much blames the whole situation not on the soldiers, but on the Black man, right? And his uppityness and the fact that he was throwing things or being violent. And so I think even before we become a nation, when we're just starting to form something new, we have that racism built into us, built into the governing and the policing and everything else. So we got to figure out a way to root that out somehow.
I think you're absolutely right, Professor Keene. And I think it's more of our decision collectively as Americans to kick the can down the road. We have had so many opportunities from the founding all the way to now to address this question, and we haven't. So our founding fathers needed our Constitution ratified. They barely got it done, only getting 9 of the 13 colonies, now states, to ratify it. And who'd they have to make a deal with? They had to make a deal with the southern states. Mm-hmm. And even though there's language in our Constitution that says we want to abolish the international slave trade, and it's there, we also allow the 3/5 compromise, we allow the fugitive slave clause, we allow other things that encode slavery into our founding document. And then we kick the can down the road. Okay, fast forward to the sectional crisis. Every step of the war towards the Civil War, we kick the can down the road. The 13th Amendment kicks the can down the road. Again in the 20s, again in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Now we're in 2020 and we're still kicking the can down the road.
We keep saying that's future me's problem.
Yeah. We're going to have to finally address this. And if we don't do it now, it's going to have to be addressed later. And who better to deal with this than us in our moment right now? We have the most diverse generations in our country's history. With Generation X, the millennials, Gen Zers, we are the most diverse. It's our problem that we've inherited from everybody else, but we are uniquely equipped to solve it. So we need to do it.
I admire your confidence, Josh.
Here comes the Gen Xer.
Professor Wallace, you should introduce yourself since we're here at the very beginning of the chat.
Hi, I'm Jerry Wallace. I think almost all of you know me in some way. So thanks for allowing me to join in on this. So I only want to say one thing about that, because I think that you know, since we're being formal here, Dr. Hebert had something very important to say, but we belong to a book club and we read a great book about white supremacy. And one thing that I think in sort of playing off of this kicking the can down the road thing is that when we talk about white supremacy, we often contextualize that particular conversation as it being a people of color problem or a minority problem. But I think that actually it's a white people problem, and it's actually our problem to solve, and we haven't stepped up to the plate to do that. So I think that if we can reposition some of these conversations, not to say that this is an African-American community or a Latino problem, and we firmly take ownership of that, then maybe we can start to address it. And it was refreshing to kind of see this a little bit with NASCAR this weekend in the world of sports, because they have traditionally been very racist, I would say, in a lot of ways, at least when I was growing up.
Very welcoming to racists.
Well, it was the big elephant in the room they wouldn't talk about, and they kind of stepped up to the plate in a way that no other sport has to today. So I think that if we could have those kinds of conversations, then we might, then I would share maybe Dr. Hebert's optimism.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that point, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see the textbook that the history department at EPCC uses as their default is Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner. The latest editions have been talking more about the sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal, who I talk about in my research. He's a Swedish dude brought over to examine the American dilemma, by which it meant most white Americans defined as the existence of Black people. His study was like almost a decade long, and he had the good fortune to publish it in 1944 after this wave of riots had happened the previous summer across the United States, so people were willing to talk. And he said the same thing that you said, Jerry. Like, the American dilemma, this is the issue of race. This is not a Black people problem. This is a white people problem. This is a problem caused by white people denying equal opportunities or rights that were promised during Reconstruction to the non-white population in the United States. Gunnar Myrdal was saying that back in 1944.
Mhm.
You know, like, it's still true.
Mhm.
But we haven't really, you know, we keep kicking that can down the road.
Bob had a question for us.
Yeah, I do have a question for all of you. You know, we hear about white privilege. We hear about a white people problem, a white this, a white that. How do you all define white? Who's white? Okay, I'm Asian American. Am I considered white? Those of you who are Hispanic or of Hispanic descent, are you considered white? What's the definition? What's the operational definition that we're going on here?
That is a great question.
It's a slippery. Race is a social construction. It changes over time. Pat?
I think when we talk about just the term white privilege, what we have to do is move away from a discussion of race and skin color and start talking about the way the American system is constructed, which privileges whiteness. And if you fit in there, then you're white. And if it excludes you, then you're not. So is this person white? Is this person white? Let's talk about how they deal with stuff. I mean, study after study after study shows that if you have an ethnic sounding name on a piece of paper where nobody can see you, you get less job interviews than if you have a Anglo sounding name. So it's not skin color, it's the system. And that's where the white privilege comes from.
Yeah.
I have a colleague that will tell me there's no such thing as white privilege, and it's like, you're an idiot. But anyway, that's where it is.
Yeah, whiteness really expands after World War II. Prior to that, it's very much driven by ethnicity. So if you were of Northern or Western European descent prior to World War II, you're in, except for if you're Irish, then you're not.
Yeah.
That was the exception to the general geographic rule of whiteness.
And Italians.
Yeah. So
Southern Italians were way down by the
Southern Italians not white.
So it's Western and Northern as long as you're Protestant.
Yes, as long as you're Protestant. If you're Catholic, so like, for example, I descend from German Catholics that came over in the 1850s. We weren't considered white because we were Catholic. Same reason that the Irish weren't considered white because they were Catholic. But really World War II and this push for cultural pluralism that had been happening since like the 20s is really when we start to be like, okay, then the Irish, like, you get promoted, you are now white, or Eastern European, Southern, so then it becomes more generally European. But even with, you know, like Hispanic is such an artificial label. What does that mean, right? Does that mean you're white, not white?
Right.
Even Middle Eastern, right? Middle Eastern, technically.
Lumped in with white on all the official forms.
Yeah, on all the official forms, white. But I mean, like, Kiki's husband is Middle Eastern, and does he have benefit from that white privilege?
Mexican.
Yeah, everybody's like, oh no, Mexican, yeah. He's Egyptian, right?
He's Egyptian, yeah.
Yeah, so then that becomes the, you know, the question, right, is it's not just, it's predicated not just on your appearance, but also, like Pat was saying, like your ethnicity, right, that kind of like a cultural sort of baggage. And again, it shifts and changes over time. So whiteness is kind of like a shifting target. And then in the United States, you know, like Bob, to come back to your point, because I know the other half of you was white, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the one drop rule dating all the way back to the 1600s in Virginia, even though you're half white, you're considered not white because you're something other than white. That's confusing, right? Like you could be, you know, like 99% white in the eyes of the legal system, you're still considered not white.
Right.
You could pass, right? Especially if, you know, like your appearance is such or your name is neutral enough, you could pass. But technically, in our legal system, that one drop rule applies. Like if you're anything other than white, you're not white, no matter how big the whiteness part of it is.
It's quite arresting sometimes to see just how racially classified this country has been. Homer Plessy of Plessy v. Ferguson, for example, could pass as a white man. He was 1/8 black. That's it. And because he was 1/8 black, he was considered a black man.
And
And
he
so,
had to tell the conductor that he was a black man.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to add to the chorus here that whiteness is such a shifting category.
Yeah.
And one thing I've been thinking a lot about the past couple of days is that whiteness is exclusive in nature. And I don't mean like you get to join the club. I mean, the definition of whiteness is all about who it excludes and not who it includes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like, even just, you know, Walter White, for example, longtime secretary for the NAACP, blonde hair, blue eyes, totally passed his way, and he never claimed whiteness for himself. He always identified as a proud black man, even though he very easily could have passed. And he actually used that passing to his advantage because he became essentially a witness to lynching. He would go throughout the South, he would blend in, and he would document lynchings. And I can't imagine how, like, emotionally gutting that experience would have been. Because, you know, because he was there to document it, like, he wasn't allowed to intervene. You know, like, how can you, like, for me, that would have been, like, my gut instinct, right? Like, how can you stand by and let this happen? But for him, like, that was his assignment, was to be an observer to lynching. And, you know, again, like, for all intents and purposes, like, people just didn't notice him.
I assume that is a Chihuahua bark.
Being as we have 5 of them, it wasn't a big jump on your part.
I was gonna say, that's not one of ours for once.
Yes. All right, Bob, that's a great question. And I think we'll be, you know, with the time we have left, we're going to circle back around to that a couple of times because of the way in which white supremacy with lowercase letters, so not like, we're not talking about the KKK or a hate group necessarily, but the overwhelming presence of white supremacy is going to, it continues to inform a lot of what is happening. So thank you for asking it. I wanted to open up the floor again for other questions that folks might have.
There was a question that Vanessa had put before she left in the chat box about monuments and who gets to be a monument.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's a great question.
That's a great question. Oh man, there was a great Twitter post today that kind of relates to this, that was trafficked around the Twitter historians today, and about, you know, the remembrance of history and, you know, what gets taught, what gets left out, and it kind of circles around to where we started. And I have a lot, Twitter historians, Erica, that is the official hashtag too. Historians on Twitter. If you want to see what historians are talking about in real time, follow that hashtag. You would be surprised how active historians are on Twitter. Jerry says fake news. Yeah. There's a really active historian community on Twitter. It's not everybody. It's mostly Kevin Cruz out of Princeton, and some others. But yeah. In any case, I want to save what I have to say about my former institution for a little later, and let someone else jump in here.
I was thinking the other day how difficult it would be to come up with a person to memorialize that is 0% problematic. Like, I think Kiki made a great point earlier today. We were chatting about, like, Teddy Roosevelt, right? Historians generally have a soft spot for Teddy Roosevelt. I tell my students he's one of my favorite Republicans ever, which is kind of saying something about me because he was a very maverick Republican. The Republican Party put him as vice president because they wanted him to be in a position that had no power, and then oops, McKinley died. So that plan didn't work out very well. But Teddy Roosevelt, while he does a lot of things, kind of like the FDR point that Bob brought up earlier, right? Does a lot of great things, still kind of problematic. when it comes to issues of race. Like Teddy Roosevelt was a very unabashed imperialist. When he wrote his memoir about the War of 1898 and the charge at San Juan Hill, he conveniently left out the all-Black regiment that preceded his unit, the Rough Riders, up the hill, and kind of paved the way, made it easier for them. We could go on and on and on. So, like, you know, the New York Museum of Natural History is removing a statue of Teddy Roosevelt from in front. So, kind of like, is there anybody from history that's not 100% problematic to talk about?
I think that statue you're talking about, though, if it was just a statue of Teddy Roosevelt, you know, that'd be okay. But it's him on horseback with a Native American and an African walking next to him on each side. And it represents manifest destiny and imperialism. And I think that's the problem with the statue, not Teddy Roosevelt. When it comes to statues with me, and like you were saying, these people do great things. Thomas Jefferson wrote the documents that we argue about, right? Did he own slaves? Yeah. Did he have an affair with one of them? Yeah. I mean, but
did he enslave literally his own children from that affair?
He's still Thomas Jefferson, right? When we talk about the Confederate statues, the only reason we even know who the hell they are is because they were traitors. They waged war against the United States. A few years back, I had a student who was doing an honors project, and she went to the malls and any place where there were people, you know, back before we actually went out. And she asked people, who was the greatest general the United States ever had? 42% said Robert E. Lee. He was never a general in the United States Army. Never.
Only a colonel.
That's what people think. He was a colonel. He was in the engineering corps. He was a commandant of cadets at West Point. But he resigned his commission and then fought against the army that he used to be in. He is a traitor. Yep. There should not be a statue to him anywhere in the United States or any Confederate. Anywhere.
Yeah, Isadora points out in the chat, it's because of the Sisters of the Confederacy that, yeah, they memorialize this to slavery. I know I wanted to let Jerry said he had something he wanted to contribute.
Yeah, I find it fascinating with this statue conversation that we actually have a controversy in our own back door, on our own backyard.
The huge statue of Juan de Oñate at the airport.
Yeah, and so like if you've been paying attention to what's going on in Albuquerque, they pretty much like tore him down. And so
it'd be a little hard to do the one at the airport though, safely.
I don't have an opinion about that one way or another. So, but I think that, you know, like I assigned the last 2 semesters, The Last Conquistador, that was the documentary done about the Oñate statue in El Paso. And I'm not kidding you, last week after, you know, what happened in Albuquerque, I got a lot of emails from students that were like, wow, we just talked about this. And, you know, I didn't really think that it was that big of a deal. And then all of a sudden what's going on, it's really relevant today. So I would encourage everybody to kind of like try to localize that conversation instead of it being this conversation way over there, some other part of the country that we might feel a little disconnected with. We, you know, it's interesting to see how El Pasoans react to that much differently than New Mexicans. In New Mexico, like, you know, we in Las Cruces, we have Oñate High School. I don't think there's any conversation about changing that high school name. Maybe there might be very low on this, you know, in the community.
Some talk about that.
Yeah, a little bit, you know, but it's not going to make any headway because it hasn't in a while. But maybe this is the time where we get to do that and have that conversation. But I find it fascinating that even though El Pasoans seem to be upset about Oñate, they seem to be more upset with the financial cost of building that statue, not the ramifications of race and, like, you know, the plight of indigenous people. The people that were upset came from New Mexico to protest that statue in El Paso. So I think you could have a great conversation with your students about that and what Oñate might say to the larger borderlands. That's just what I wanted to chime in about.
When I talk to my students about that documentary, The Last Conquistador, They watch it, they write about it. Most of them didn't know it was a statue of Oñate. They born and bred in El Paso, went to school here. I knew there was a statue out at the airport, but they didn't know it was Oñate. So that brings up a different conversation that we had an hour ago.
It's called the Equestrian, isn't it?
Yeah, they don't even name it after him.
But you look at it, and it's so obviously a conquistador.
And it's a big ass statue. I mean, it is huge
in the world of an equestrian statue. Third largest in the world. Apparently, one in Prague is bigger.
I read this. Yeah, I think Jerry, you make a really good point that we should be localizing this because it is in our backyard. And you know, it's interesting. A lot of the students I talk to, they're very ready to get rid of Confederate monuments, unless, you know, usually the pushback that I hear when I have my students write about, you know, what do you think should be done, is like, well, you know, they're good reminders of what happened. They're monuments to our misdeeds, and they serve as reminders to us to not do it again.
But the signage isn't there to support that.
That's the thing. Yeah.
They're not monuments to our misdeeds if it doesn't say what they are, and it doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah, Texas A&M is having that conversation right now. I'm an Aggie because Sullivan Ross, who is really integral to the foundation of the school, there's a statue of him in front of the academic building. Like there's a tradition that you leave pennies at his feet for good luck on exams and things. I totally did that before my dissertation defense, by the way. He's also got a very troubled past with the Confederacy and with race. And so there's this question over like, how do you approach that? And I think, you know, Jerry's got a point in making it local and talking about things that, you know, the students have a personal connection to. And that makes it more real. Like when Josh tells his students about his personal connection to a very infamous Confederate statue.
Yeah. So I guess, is that my cue to talk about?
Go for it.
Formerly Silent Sam?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a couple things that we need to put in context here. Number one, we are talking about the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a state that joined the Confederacy. It was by decree of their state legislature, the last one to join, though Tennessee would challenge that, which I learned from a student. It was a fun conversation, really a fun conversation. Anyway, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was chartered in the 1790s, 1795. It is in North Carolina. Guess who built that university? Slaves. Every brick. Every single brick. There were students at UNC Tar Heels, who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. In 1913, the Daughters of the Confederacy, the group that we are talking about, decided that they were going to memorialize the Tar Heels who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and they decided to erect a statue of a general, just Civil War soldier, and a Confederate Civil War soldier, and they put him on the front porch, essentially, of the university, the very front quad. You could see him from the street as you drove by. He had a gun in his hand, an ammo pouch, which very clearly said CSA on it. And I always ask my students, what direction do you think he was facing? He was facing north, always looking north, still protecting the university. Now, when that statue was dedicated in 1913, okay, 1913, this isn't 1866, 1867, this is 1913. Julian Carr comes to the Chapel Hill campus, and he's kind of this pillar of the Chapel Hill Carborough community. In fact, the town next to Chapel Hill, Carborough, where all of us poor graduate students had to live, because that's where you could afford to rent an apartment. that carries his name, Julian Carr comes and gives the dedication speech. And in this speech, he celebrates the Confederacy. He celebrates the supremacy of the white race, the white Anglo-Saxon race, as he puts it. And then he brags about whipping a black woman for being too uppity, not 100 yards from where that statue stood. It's all in the dedication speech. And I let my students read it because they should. Now, that statue has been a problem ever since it was put there. And it became even more of a problem as the university started to let Black students onto campus, finally. So imagine being some of the first Black students ever to come on this campus and to see this Confederate soldier greet you literally at the front door every time you step on the same bricks that your ancestors put there as slaves. That is a powerful reminder that you are not supposed to be there. That is what it's designed to do. Now, as time has gone on, students continually press for the removal of the statue. When I was there, from 2011 to 2016, especially after the murder of Trayvon Martin, the events in Ferguson, and other occurrences really brought Silent Sam back into the forefront. And Silent Sam was up on the, it was a big discussion. And the thing of it is that the University of North Carolina campus has a lot of racist monuments. And some of it was in the building names. So we're not talking about people who are just casually racists. We're talking about grand wizards of the KKK. Okay, these are the actual hood-wearing MFers that you don't want to celebrate. And so one of their names adorned a building that housed the religious studies department, among others, and they got the name changed. Student activists got the name changed. And the university, in its infinite wisdom, instead of renaming the building after a prominent African-American who went to the UNC campus, they just decided to call it Carolina Hall. Give it the most generic name possible. And then passed a bylaw or whatever that said no building or anything at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill could be renamed for 16 years. 16 years. They just repealed that the other day. Good for them. About time. Took you long enough. So, after I leave, student activists are really pushing for the removal of Silent Sam as more and more instances of police brutality arise and whatnot. It's time for this thing to come down. The UNC Board of Governors is run by a bunch of conservative white dudes who want that statue there. They weren't going to move it. So, student activists, they didn't plan it, it just kind of happened. They threw a rope around its neck and they yanked it down. Finally. And it got carted away to some undisclosed location. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on with this, like the campus police harassing student activists, spying on student activists, protecting the white supremacist neo-Confederates who came to campus, quite literally. Also, the university, through the Board of Trustees and others, made a couple of backhanded deals to give the sons of Confederate veterans the statue to do with what they want. And then they were promising like a couple of $1 million to build it some memorial hall or something like that. And then it all got kind of wound through the courts, and it turns out the board of directors were in bed, or the board of trustees were in bed with the sons of Confederate veterans. And now all of this is being exposed on top of UNC's sports cheating scandal. So we're just having a great time at UNC right now. But anyway, that's the power that these statues have. They are enshrinements to white supremacy. And the white supremacist establishment is going to do whatever it takes to keep them there. And it's our responsibility to push back against that, because they're participating in a poor form of history. And I'm going to put my soapbox away now.
You can tell he's very passionate about that topic. Related to this, because we did have another student question, but the student question related to this was, Abby was asking, have y'all heard of Washington and Lee University in Lexington considering changing their name? Alumni are upset because this is a university that essentially glorified Lee and taught curriculum as to not offend his name.
My former colleague at UNC was a graduate of Washington and Lee. I know that is like, after UVA, University of Virginia, Washington and Lee is probably like the most like kind of mythologized institution in Virginia, which might upset its rival, whose name I can't remember right now. But my friend taught there. Anyway.
Yeah, I want to say as a knee-jerk response, like, I mean, I always edit myself, especially if I'm in the classroom. But as a knee-jerk response, I'd be like, to alumni upset, be like, why don't we just name it Washington and Grant? That would really, really upset people to name it after the opposing general to Lee. But yeah,
Grant deserves a whole lot of praise. But
yeah, Grant is another one of those very complicated men. Who occasionally problematic. He does have an interesting rise during the Civil War, but I do feel like that's something that, you know, is a good discussion to have about changing the name. And at the very least, if you're not going to consider changing the name, change the curriculum, right? If you've invested very heavily in mythologizing Lee, who, as Pat pointed out, is a literal traitor.
Not a very good general, oh, by the way.
And not a very good general. Oh, they were thinking about Lincoln, Washington and Lincoln University. That would be interesting. I like that idea. Yeah, I mean, at the very least, change the curriculum if you're not going to change the name would be my thought process. I know that there's a lot invested in names, but institutions change names over time. Like, that's not an uncommon practice.
Look at UTEP.
Yeah, look at UTEP, look at Texas A&M.
Yeah.
You know, any number of schools.
I'm sorry, Melissa, I didn't mean to interrupt here. I have a question though. So I see a lot on Instagram and other social media platforms when addressing these particular kinds of issues. Should the Washington Redskins change their name? Should these universities change their name? There's always the other side of this conversation that's saying, well, you're erasing our history. You are trying to reinvent history. You're trying to re-envision history in some different way. I'm curious what everybody would think about that. You know, like, how do you address that particular question? And, you know, I don't think it's a winning conversation a lot of times because people are pretty entrenched in their views about this, but I think as historians, we are often expected to have a good answer for that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I say name the Washington Redskins a more apt name. How about the Washington Swamp Creatures? That's my...
Well, you know, everybody always talks about the Redskins, and certainly that's a terrible name. But we have a baseball team, plays out of Arlington, called the Texas Rangers. That's a white supremacist group 100 years ago. I mean, why do we have a baseball team named after them, of all people, right? I don't think people thought things through, or maybe they did. I don't know. But I would be more in favor of changing that name before some of the other ones.
Well, I mean, we'll put it on the you know, everything is first priority, you know, A, B, C, D. Like, you know, obviously the Washington football franchise is up there. I know Cleveland's mascot has gone under some revision, because if you look at, and I kid you not, this was the name, Chief Wahoo.
Yeah.
It is the most racist thing I may have ever seen. And it was on the front of their cap for half a century. To Jerry's point, I think one of the things that we need to emphasize as historians, and something that may be shocking to non-historians, because there's this word that floats around when people want to criticize history, and it's the word revisionist. When somebody says, oh, this is a revisionist history, they aren't saying it to be nice. Usually what they're saying is that you are incorrect in some way. And the thing about it, ladies and gentlemen, is history is a revisionist exercise. It requires constant revision.
Yeah.
Because we learn new things. Sometimes there's new evidence that we didn't know about before, or the way that we look at the past has changed because the people who are doing the examination of the past has changed. And this is no different than the sciences.
Yeah.
The sciences are revisionist too. I mean, the whole point of the scientific method is to replicate and replicate and replicate until you get a different result, and then you have to adjust to that different result. Well, guess what? Historians are doing the same thing. We're replicating, we're examining, we're seeing if that theory holds up, and if it doesn't, then we got to change it. And whether that becomes the case because of methodology or because of new evidence, we have to adjust. So if we are saying that this is a new way of looking at things, or this is an update, it's not because we want to erase the narrative that has happened before, because we need to update it.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the history of Reconstruction, like up through the 1950s, the dominant sort of academic take on Reconstruction was that carpetbaggers and Black people kind of screwed over the South during Reconstruction. And today, like, that is not the way we understand Reconstruction. And Eric Foner, who is the author of the textbook most of us use, is in fact kind of like one of the leading scholars pushing back on that school and that narrative. And you'd be hard pressed to find a historian today that would agree with that version of Reconstruction. But
I would just say one thing real quick. It also implies that somehow history is fixed, and that there's an official history, and there is indeed not an official history.
No. Right. There are accepted narratives, but that's because they have provided a pretty compelling argument. And that argument hasn't been successfully challenged. Now we're doing some challenging. And
did you want to get to Adelie's question?
Yeah, and I don't think she's in the chat anymore, but she asked a really good question. Adelie asked us, how are we able to overcome racial discrimination in our society? Since it's been going on for forever, is there some kind of resolution, or will it always be around?
The pessimist to me wants to say that we're going to keep kicking the can down the road and it's always going to be around. But that's the pessimist knee-jerk response for me.
I think there's I'm a bit of a pessimist too, although I've been reading a book called White Fragility. Mm-hmm. And listening to some of her, the author's interviews and stuff. And essentially what it's saying is that we're all racist, and it's not necessarily our fault because we were raised in it, right? And it's only our fault, and we should only feel truly guilty if we don't do something about it. So I think at the very least, because of what's happening today, we are all very much aware of the racism that is in every part of our society, and even within us, even if we don't necessarily think we're racist, and to constantly combat that. And perhaps if we are able to constantly be vigilant in our daily lives and in the world around us, then perhaps we can move past that into a more, bring out the nerd in me, the more Star Trek like universe or something, right?
Yes, I had a friend who, I'm sorry I interrupted you, Dr. Esmacher. I was going to say, I had a friend who ran for Congress, and she called her platform Star Trek values. So you saying that reminded me of that. And anyway, I think you're right, Kiki, that it's like the tide, right? It kind of ebbs and flows. And there are going to be some times where it seems like discrimination isn't as bad as it is. Even if it is, we just don't see it. It's going to be a matter of people in power or people who have privilege calling it out and laying it bare. Because the other people who have that same privilege aren't going to hear it from the minority group. They're just not going to hear it. It has to come from the white community. And that's been the case. Black people had been clamoring for civil rights for decades. And it wasn't until white people figured it out, because some of their own got harmed in all of this, advocating for Black civil rights, that anything happened. So,
if I may, so I concur with my colleague here, right? I think part of us as educators is constantly challenging the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And certainly that is going to have an impact on future generations. When I was in grad school, my mentor said, if you want to change something, it takes more than 3 generations to do so. So it is possible, but we have to constantly be challenging this, right? And just from my perspective, right, in criminology and criminal justice, we had an opportunity to change. In 1987, the case of McCleskey v. Kemp, if you don't know it, I urge you to see it. It was a death penalty case, and in that case, McCleskey's counsel said, "Hey, there's rampant discrimination within the death penalty system." Right, and they showed the Balda study where it demonstrated that. And in his opinion, Justice Powell said, even if we take this, that would mean that we have to change the entire system, and that's too difficult, right? So what does that tell us about, what we as individuals or those in position of power have to say? So therefore, I think if we start challenging this narrative and we start to tell individuals, right, that could have a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Constant vigilance. I'm going to show my millennial here. It's a very Harry Potter thing to say. As I don't know, the Gen Zers who are on our call can confirm that you're not a millennial unless you reference Harry Potter, because that's apparently some of the things that they're making fun of us for on the TikToks and stuff. And yeah, I'm being old right now. Sorry. All right. Abby had a question, and I think this is a good one. She says that I've said, Abby has said, that this is an era of racial division brought on by the divisive rhetoric of the President of the United States. Do you think this is because of our president, or is it brought on by societal ideals? It's a great question. Dr. Esmacher, you're muted.
Yes, because the dogs were getting surly. I would say that as much as, it's very tempting to lay blame at the feet solely of President Trump, he doesn't come from nowhere. Like, he doesn't just kind of spring up fully formed and all of a sudden people are like, oh yeah, this guy sounds great. Like, he clearly expresses ideas that were already there, that were already things that people kind of believed in or held, but maybe weren't afraid to say. It's too soon to tell. This is why I don't cover President Obama in my History 1302 class yet. It's too soon to tell whether President Obama is the blip, the aberration in the historical trends, or President Trump is. I'm really hoping President Trump is, but again, it's too soon to tell. And a lot of this, I feel like, is kind of like a last gasp, knee-jerk reaction to change. Like, as Dr. Everett mentioned at the beginning, like, the United States is the most diverse it's ever been, especially among younger generations. And then there's this fear of eroding white privilege and eroding white power. And I feel like Donald Trump is kind of just the manifestation of that.
It's made it okay to say the things that were not okay to say out loud, right? There's always been, I think Bring the War Home might speak to that at least in the later chapters of the book Dr. Wallace mentioned earlier, in that there has been a big push in the 80s and the 90s, especially, of white supremacists and anti-government groups coming together and sort of preaching about this, their beliefs, and that they want to take over, either end the government or take it over or whatever. And I think they're the ones that may have participated in bringing Trump around. Certainly his base was that. And Trump is a businessman, and he is a brand, and he's going to go where he thinks that it's going to be. Not to say that he isn't actually racist, he is, but I think he saw that undercurrent and really grabbed onto it.
Absolutely.
I would like to add one thing to that really quick. I think one thing that I find always surprising in the classroom is, it's definitely a generational thing, is like, one, how many of my students think that women are equal to men today? I find that very surprising. And the other thing is like that racism doesn't exist. A lot of my students seem to think that in some ways, and I'm not sure where that comes from, and that's outside of the scope of this. But what I would like to say with to answer this question in maybe like turn it just about 180 degrees, I think that racism has been alive, and just it's been right underneath the surface. And what President Trump allowed to happen, or what the election of President Trump did, is it gave a lot of people to be very confident in the fact that they could start talking about things that were you didn't say outside. You didn't say those loud parts, those parts. What word am I trying to think?
Those parts out loud.
Yeah, you didn't say that out loud, and he gave people confidence to do that. So I think that it's clearly always been here. It's been festering, and what we've seen with President Trump is that fester has sort of popped. Now, the encouraging thing about that is it seems that a lot of people that support President Trump seem to be older and from a demographic that holds on to particular ideas. And so it's cooling and encouraging to see that a lot of people are just like a lot of younger people are rejecting that. So I like to think of it optimistically as a blimp. So, I'm hoping that this is it's going to give us a lot of fodder as historians, 15, 20 years from now, to look back at this period and say, not only did I live through that, but let me tell you some cool stories that sort of happened in that particular period,
We should all meet again here in Zoom in 20 years and see if we were right, if it was a blip or not.
Yeah.
You have to survive it.
That's true.
And that's easier for us as white people who are professors than for students of color.
To add on to this, I'm gonna plug a scholar's book real quick. I'm holding it up. There it is. Anyway, it's Heather Cox Richardson's latest book. It's called How the South Won the Civil War. And she's not arguing, just to put everybody at ease, that the South actually won the military conflict. They lost. They don't like to remember that every so often, but they lost. But what her book is arguing is that Confederate ideology stuck around. And where it went west. And it started to filter out of, like Texas and into Arizona and into New Mexico. I'm going east, sorry. New Mexico, and then into Arizona, and then into California. And you get people along the way who kind of embody this Confederate. Like Barry Goldwater, for example. And she even puts Ronald Reagan in the conversation, which I know one of our colleagues in our department would not particularly care to hear, but sorry, buddy, that's the way it is. And I would say that if we're following Richardson's argument, and everybody should read this book, it's brilliant. You can do it in 2 days. It's only like 180 pages, and she's a brilliant writer, so it's a fast read. Trump is just the latest kind of zit that's popping up from this kind of oily underbelly of American racism. He's different because he's a different kind of person than Barry Goldwater was. And he's very different than Ronald Reagan. Reagan could convince anybody of just about anything. But Trump, like, he's much more divisive. Like, you're not going to see the kinds of electoral college math for Donald Trump as you saw for Ronald Reagan, especially in '84. Like, my God, only Nixon did better. So I would argue that Trump is the latest in a line, and he kind of matches this trend of this kind of neo-Confederate ideology. And I think I saw an article today, and I don't know if it was Slate or if it was The Atlantic, but the title of the article was Trump is the Confederate president, or something like that. And I think that's an argument that we historians need to wrestle with.
We do have 5 minutes left, and I did want to make sure that we get time to get to Erica and Laura's related questions, specifically about resources for professors, about teaching students about race or racism.
Yeah, so to answer Erica's question, I wish there was a manual for how to talk about race. There isn't. I'm sorry. There are syllabi out there that, you know, you just read as much as you can. I know that the history department is reading, we're reading 3 books. We're reading Paulo Freire, we're reading Iwojima, her book, and we're reading something about, it's a book about how to teach in the inner city.
You want to teach in the hood?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that one. I can't remember all the titles.
Christopher Minden.
So as history professors, do you not have like a set, like this is what we talk about when we talk about race? Is it just everyone brings what they know?
If you were to take my class and Josh's class and Melissa's and Jerry's and Kiki's class, you'd get 6 different things.
You get more of the same than you would if you took one of us versus some of the other professors in our department. The history department is very notoriously protective of academic freedom. And so even us trying to come up with like a departmental guideline about how we talk about this would be fought tooth and nail just on that principle.
But we can't even agree with what plagiarism is.
No. Or if the Renaissance was a thing.
That's another conversation for another day.
I'm sorry. I've been keeping the medieval in.
So yeah, so we don't have, that's one of the reasons that as our reading group this summer, we're reading a couple of books on race and pedagogy and how we discuss this to try to start that conversation in our department. We can't kind of like make it mandatory, but we can at least start to kind of create some semblance of guidelines and resources for our department for professors. And because we also do, I mean, we have a pretty large full-time department. We also have a lot of part-time faculty. So if we can kind of create this resource that can be used in common by everybody in our department, I think it would be helpful.
Yes, and
say yes, that would be helpful.
It would be. And I think I know the reading group has discussed this, and it's my job to put it in play. But I think that we would like to start inviting other faculty to join our reading group, and we may not be necessarily reading something that has to do with race or how to teach race in a particular month, but we certainly entertain those sorts of books. Like we read Kathleen Ballou's Bring the War Home, which we keep talking about. Obviously that book had an effect on us because we keep bringing it up. But we read a book a month and we meet to talk about it. And I will start advertising in community fairs and all that sort of stuff to get some more people. And students, if you're still listening to us crazy professors, you can feel free to join us too. We'll figure out how to make that work. because it's one of the great joys of being in college is getting to read stuff, which I know sounds like more work, but it's like one of the best things about being in college is being able to have the time to read and to talk about it with people. So, you know, you should join us too.
Your food when you guys meet as a book club?
Yes, cookies.
Cookies.
Yeah, because we do it, you know, over virtual, so you just bring your own cookies.
Yeah, since we're going to be virtual for a while, yeah, everybody just kind of, for me, it'd be like, let's bring a beer, wine.
Yeah, you can bring anything you want, Erica.
I'm making brownies right now.
Brownies.
Brownies, yes. Yeah. Oh, books. Yeah, books that challenge you to the core, Marco. Yeah, absolutely. Baloo's book did.
Yeah, that
Baloo's
was
book was.
that was a difficult read. I mean, it was an important read, but a difficult read. I definitely got stares when I was like reading it at coffee shops and places. When I was going to the National Archives, I carried it with me and read it on my downtime, and people were just.
Also, cheers to Kathleen Ballou, who testified in front of Congress, and her interlocutor from the other side was Candace Owens. And Dr. Ballou, well, she did well.
She won.
Yeah. Anyway, and then the other question from Laura, we should be having more discussions about, you know, sorts of assignments and stuff. As a historian, I'm gonna be very historian here, is make them read primary sources. It's the best way to combat anything.
Yes,
No,
I agree. Yes, primary sources are as important as more. I know you argue for more important than secondary, and so but they are. And I was just going to say that I've learned a lot, because even like some of the discussions or the topics that you were talking about in this Zoom gathering, I you know, it gives me ideas to do like discussion starters in class, or conversation starters, or as Melissa was talking about, like reflection journals, or, you know, oral history, all that, you know, because it's just, there's so much that can still be used. And I was just going to say there should be a part 2 to this gathering as well.
yeah.
Thanks.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, especially if, you know, like, because we have people from like government and speech and history and criminal justice and art here today. I think like there's definitely like we could have a whole nother discussion specifically focused on how can our disciplines talk to each other on these issues.
And so other faculty, let's collaborate, maybe not this time around because the schedule's already been produced, but in the future, for faculty development weeks, let's put together some interdisciplinary panels about talking about race, violence, the you know, the political conversation about history or policing or whatever. Let's work together and really put it out there for the rest of the faculty to take advantage of.
I think in the current climate, with everything going virtual and all that kind of stuff, we can just do that on our own.
Yeah, well, we can
put together a panel and let's figure out what we want to talk about and invite people to come to it.
Okay.
And then I can force them to give us credit.
Yes. Yes, we will use
for those of y'all that need it.
Yeah, we will use you as a cudgel.
I tell everybody when you want to do something and you need a full professor to put their name on something, I'm your boy.
All right.
Especially when I can put down their district coordinator for the honors program, it opens doors.
Yep. I was about to say, that's right, Pat. You are now a full professor, right?
Yeah, I have been.
All right,
folks. I got another 4 years.
You'll get there.
Eventually. All right, folks. Well, let me say thank you for everyone who came. We did record it. I'm going to upload it to the brand new EPCC History YouTube channel. And we will we'll figure out how to disseminate that so that your students can watch it, or if students you want to recap some of the things that you heard, or if you didn't get a chance to see all of it, you can check out the very beginning. As we continue these conversations, which I think we should, we can put future conversations and presentations up on that channel as well. So with that said, thanks again, everybody who came out. Stay safe, stay healthy, wear a mask. I don't think anybody has that problem, but you know, wear a mask. And we'll talk to y'all soon.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank y'all.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Melissa.